Hi everyone, I'm Wendi Muse, creator of the Left Pocket Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to give a little bit of background. I spoke with this week's guest, Anoa Changa, on March 8th, which was International Women's Day, but as last week was spring break, I did not release this recording until today. That said, some of the events that we discussed in the episode, such as Bernie Sanders' Economic Forum, have already transpired and have been linked in the show notes accordingly. On a related note, while we mentioned the absurd suggestion made by pseudo-leftists in the summer of 2017 that the left should see the alt-right, better known as white supremacists, as allies to quote-unquote take down the deep state, the same beaten-down dead horse revived itself again last week while the show was on break, as two purported left-leaning news commentary shows supported the suggestion themselves. Anoa and I again had to speak out against this proposal. You can learn more about the proposal itself and many of the problems with it by checking out the podcast discussion hosted by Benjamin Dixon that Anoa and I had during last week. Now that that's out of the way, I'd like to formally introduce this week's guest, Anoa Changa. In addition to her work as an attorney, Anoa has been a grassroots digital organizer, providing strategic support to several progressive organizations. Anoa hosts the show The Way with Anoa, a podcast and YouTube channel focusing on politics, news, and community engagement. She serves as the Director of Political Advocacy and co-managing editor at the Progressive Army, and she runs the Georgia-focused political blog, Peach Perspective. Here's my discussion with her. So today I'm here with Anoa Changa. Anoa, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yo, I'm so excited. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So we go way all the way back to the primaries of 2016, which is obviously not that far back, but it feels like it was.
It feels like a lifetime.
It really does. And I think it took some of our lives as well. It definitely aged a bunch of us. Mentally, physically, etc. But it's funny because that's when I actually learned about you and your own sort of flavor of politics. So at the time, this was in, I want to say, pretty early on, around 2015, I noticed that you were working with Benjamin Dixon, and you and several other people who were involved in his channel were making videos and talking about some of the issues that were happening in the primaries and challenges that you all saw as being Black Bernie supporters. And so it's one of the things that I started actually listening to you all and sort of watching the show about. And I said, wow, this is really interesting. And it made me focus in and listen a little bit more to Bernie Sanders' message. Given I was critical, but I also think that hearing other people who were coming from similar backgrounds or had, similar political standpoints expressing support of him was really important. But I also noticed that with time and after the primaries were over that you became a rather outspoken critic of some of the things that went down during the primaries and areas where you thought Sanders could improve. So can you talk a bit about your experiences during the primaries and also where you are now in terms of your opinion of Sanders and what you think he needs to do, if at all, to improve going forward?
Well, as you probably know, I'm a neoliberal shill now, according to a certain reporter from The Intercept. But no, that's a really good question. I think the evolution coming out of the primary process and getting to know a bunch of the staffers, several staffers who worked on the campaign, who now work with various organizations or running, for office themselves, particularly, getting to know Marcus Ferrell.
And Marcus is running for office now too, right?
Marcus is running for office out in Arizona. Okay. Michelle Watley does a lot of political work with the ACLU and other organizations out of Missouri. And actually, Michelle's probably all over the Midwest now doing work. I mean, there's so many really great people that I got to know who worked on the campaign. And folks range, in their opinion and even in their approach post-primary, what they did and stuff. So that was really good to get to talk to people because they were on the inside, right? So they had that perspective. Also, from the outside, as a grassroots supporter, I was getting started through working with Women for Bernie, which is now Women for Justice. and African Americans for Bernie, which I'm no longer affiliated with either. But so working with Women for Bernie, which is now Women for Justice, I ended up becoming a part of their core leadership team, as I oversaw their Facebook state page admin, and then also as the research team lead. And that's how I actually started doing commentary, was doing interviews for on behalf of Women for Bernie. And it was really interesting, because actually I started doing that, and then I started doing commentary for Stacey Hopkins and Scout Smith. They're local organizers. You guys probably heard Stacey, if you listened to my show before, you've heard her on there. But anyway, they used to do a podcast called Down South and Dirty on Sunday afternoon. So they would have me come on and do like a 10-minute rundown about what was going on, basically like in the Bernie progressive like movement space, right? Really kind of capturing what the grassroots was doing. And that's actually how Ben heard me. So like thinking about my support of Bernie Sanders, like my support of Bernie Sanders, like I was one of those, I don't think I'm gonna vote in the primary people. And I have voted because I thought that's what I was supposed to do since I was 18. You know what I'm saying? So when this cycle came around, and I was like, I can't bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. I mean, like my thought was, we're obviously going to have to vote for her, you know what I'm saying? Because we don't want a Republican, blah, blah, blah. But my father, my father and my stepfather are both really, engaging people in my life. And I was talking with my dad, and my dad was like, "We should check out Bernie Sanders. He had just announced or he was about to announce." And I had heard of Bernie Sanders, but I wasn't like really that hip to him, per se. But my dad has been a Bernie person since like Air America days, and he's watched him filibuster on C-SPAN and stuff like that. So my dad was like on it. And so I was like, all right. So that's how I ended up volunteering then with Women for Justice. I saw it as an opportunity for me to get engaged and involved. I had children when I was in college, so I haven't been able to be as active, politically and socially as I would like to have been. I've been raising babies, and that was my focus, and coaching, soccer and running football leagues. That's what I had been focusing on previously. Now with my kids, entering middle school and high school respectively, it opened up the opportunity to get involved in a really important and meaningful way, right? Like I really believe that working through the opportunity that presented itself with the type of grassroots enthusiasm around Bernie Sanders was a real opportunity to engage people in politics in a way we haven't seen in quite some time. We had already seen the explosion of the Black Lives Matters movement, right? It was really awakening something in people all over the country, and with the various movements and offshoots and organizations. We've seen Million Hoodies formed, Dream Defenders, so many different organizations, Sada's Daughters, all over the place. We see people really taking control themselves. So electorally, I thought this was the same type of opportunity to really engage underrepresented and marginalized communities. We're talking about political revolution. Like it was exciting, right? But it's still rhetoric-y, but it was exciting, and it presented a challenge and opportunity. What I didn't count on was the fact that, being someplace, we had just moved to Georgia. We had been in Georgia almost a year at the time, not having my own community really to kind of leverage and be able to do that with. So that's been, the past few years for me has been finding my own community and political home here locally that I think we all need to think about when we're like, yeah, let's get out there and spread the good word. If you don't have that base locally, it makes it a little bit more difficult to really get out there and leverage on behalf of candidates that you're supporting. But that's what the digital campaigning is easier in some ways, because you could still make a difference and engage and build community. We were helping to write talking points, and, with the research team for Women for Bernie, we had researched several different issues and came down. We had this big research doc that we developed, and then we condensed it down to talking points for our page, for people who are page admins, for people who are going to write stuff on our behalf, just all types of stuff, right? Because we wanted to contribute to the conversation, particularly, when we think about how the media blackout was working, and we saw this independent media space growing in some ways too, around covering his campaign and the grassroots activism around it. So that was really exciting me to think of that. It was also really interesting, the pushback, like I did one interview for Women for Bernie one time, and it ended up really being more of a debate. It was on the Canadian broadcast channel. It was an early morning show. And the other woman was an older, presumably white woman who was a volunteer for Hillary out of Maryland. She's a stay-at-home mother. She was a housewife. And she was very condescending, you know, and it really was, I think someone actually wrote an article and then used that clip in it to talk about the clash between, like, you know, newer third wave feminists, which I was supposed to represent in their piece, and like that older, you know, bra burning guard, right? And so that was interesting going through all that. And when you're in the middle of the primary, you're trying to, you know, build space, and then we had to deal with how do you actually make the case to Black people. And what we found, if there was actually the investment in outreach and engaging, you know, black voters, that people would get excited when they learned about him or learned about what he was standing for in comparison to other candidates, right? Because I remember when we were on the West, and people would ask us, like, oh my God, where did you get this from? Do you have more Bernie buttons? Do you have more signs? Like, it was so the interest was there. It just wasn't, you know, the same investment. And, like, not saying that he was going to come in and sweep the South in the primary, but, you know, there were people all across the board who were interested in connecting with the campaign. That just never happened. And I definitely think that in looking at things going forward, if he is to run again, or whoever the heir apparent would be to his mantle is to run, that real connection to people needs to be built now. And he actually had some really meaningful relationships all across the country with people of color, with Black people in particular, that just weren't leveraged effectively. And part of my growing observation and frustration, I just felt like the core team, like, you know, Tad Devine and Jeff Weaver, just were not, they're used to running his campaigns in Vermont, right? So I don't think they understood how to build not only that diverse coalition necessary to win, or to at least make a strong showing, but I don't know that they really understood about how to run a grassroots campaign. Because when you think about it, that was a political insurgency. You know, you're running up against the most formidable political machine in the past 50 years, approximately, right? I mean, you might say in terms of the Democrats, you know, the Kennedy family might be an equal comparison. You know, on the other side, you'd have like the Bushes, right? But the Clintons have been deeply involved in politics for the last 40 plus years. They pretty much have either hired or introduced everybody and their mama to their spouses or exes or whatever, you know? So, like, there's this huge, deep relationship. And I don't think that his campaign really leveraged. You know, I was surprised when I stumbled upon, I think someone had sent it to one of the pages I helped run, when I stumbled upon this video of Black elders from California. They did a roundtable on their own. And when I'm talking about elders, I'm like, you know, I'm guesstimating that these were Black people over 60. And, you know, that was the older Black votes. That was a block he had a hard time connecting. But when you have people who are not only familiar with him, some of them had worked with him previously in different things over the years. So, you know, there are people out there that had relationships with him that just weren't leveraged properly in this political process. And maybe it's because that's just not how he works as a person. So it didn't translate well to campaign strategy. I really don't know. But I do know, like, just thinking about some of the things that happened during the campaign, it was very frustrating. Like, they were so conscientious and concerned about someone like a DeRay, who wasn't going to support them, who wasn't going to do anything to help them, that they would, you know, kind of, you know, chastise someone like myself and my co-admin, Yamina Rowland, over the term Black burner, right? Like, so Yamina came up with the term Black burner because people who were Bernie supporters were referring to themselves as burners. So Yamina was like, well, I'm a Black burner. We have a page on Facebook called Black Burner Coalition. She would use the hashtag. We have been using the hashtag forever. I think Stacy and a couple other folks started, you know, using it too. It wasn't like it was a real big deal. One of my paying attention to us. All of a sudden, someone got a hold of an email that was sent out on my behalf here locally because we were trying to have a conference call about African American and Latino outreach collectively, right? Here in Georgia, Atlanta in particular. And somehow that got posted on social media, and DeRay got tweeted about it. And, you know, him being the person he is, instead of looking at the person's name on it, instead of asking the question, because he proved in subsequent tweets within 10 minutes of each other that he was able to get someone high up enough on the campaign, and apparently Dr. West from his tweets, on the phone to clarify, he didn't have to handle things the way he did. And that ended up causing a ton of stress and drama for myself and Yamina, including the campaign apparently asking, I think it was Alana for Bernie who sent out the email for us, including the campaign asking them to please cease and desist use of the term. And they directed it to me, and I was just like, no, why would I do that? I don't have to listen to them, because they were so worried about the backlash. So you had a bunch of Hillary supporters like really up in arms. It's just like, y'all don't have a comparable term. If two black women are comfortable using it and saying it, I mean, and I understand that some folks might not like it, that's fine too. But it was just unnecessarily dramatic. And we saw things like that happening, right? There's this false outrage connected around him. And I think that a lot of us who would be more inclined to criticize and to be analytical about issues weren't, because we were also combating that stuff, right? So, but Ben and I came to a point in our own like commentary where we were just like, we have to kind of challenge and push back, because there are so many missed opportunities happening here. And whether it was talking about education, because Bernie would have stuff like in like when they have to do those surveys for if they're going to get endorsed by a union or organization, he would have some really great language. But it was nothing that was worked into his campaign spiel.
Right. I was going to say it seemed to me that there was a great disconnect between what people were doing on the ground and then what was being channeled through Bernie to the larger public, right?
Right.
The other thing, I'm curious, why were people upset about the term black burner? What was like, I missed really this controversy.
No, I really think it was like, it was a whole big deal, because Marcus, who was African American Outreach Director, like Yamina and I tracked down his contact information. We had heard him speak. I had heard him speak on a conference call. We tracked down his information, and we were like, we're here. We're grassroots side. We want to help, whatever we can do. And he got so much flack when that happened. He actually stopped talking to us for a little bit. And, he and I are really close friends now, but I told him, I was like, yo, like, I was really bad. And he was like, I know. He's like, because everybody was really worried because DeRay, has such a big platform on Twitter, and it became this whole big thing. And there wasn't really actually a good reason. Like, people were just upset. People who were pro-Hillary were just upset, and they made it into a really big thing that it wasn't. Like, it's like even the email they were sharing around very clearly said what it was, who it was from and stuff. And it was just the most ridiculous thing, but it stands out. It's actually the reason why I don't like Blue Vest now. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's a big part of the reason why I can't stand Blue Vest, because I think he's petty and opportunistic, but that's a whole other story. But again, like they were so, at least, whether they thought they were going to get his support or not, I don't know. But they were at least hoping that they wouldn't anger him, I guess, right? Because he is such a large influencer. And that is that's a real problem with our politics. We have people who are not really actually engaged for all of our collective improvement. And they're engaged for their own, whatever their own personal reasons are. But they hold such sway over, opinion and for some of these candidates. So it was really interesting. But like, when we would read stuff, like we would do research, we would read stuff. I'm like, this is great. Why isn't he working this part of like K through 12 education? Like he was talking about, inequity in public school funding, like in different written things that were out there that we would find. I'm like, he needs to be working this in. Like, this is like really great stuff that directly affects our communities. And it wasn't being talked about. It wasn't a part of the shtick, right? It was very like linear. It was very stuck on a few to break up the big banks. He had some really great zingers, but they didn't resonate. We weren't breaking it down and connecting to people with why this stuff mattered. And that's something that I still challenge folks on. When we're saying we need campaign finance reform, when we're saying break up the big banks, all that stuff, I get that I understand, you understand that it's the right thing to say or do. But how do we relate this to the average person, to the brother or sister on the block, to somebody in the holler? How do we relate this to their lives that it moves them? Because from my understanding, that's not going to help me eat. Like, from my understanding, that's not going to help me get a job if I don't understand the connectedness, right? So that's been one of my consistent critiques with folks who are progressives, who are engaging this political space. It's so wonderful that so many of us, came to this and are really enthused and engaged and stuff. But there's so many more people who have been like disenchanted and disaffected with the process. we have to find a way to reach and communicate with people and help them understand why this even matters. And there are those who may argue that it doesn't matter, and that's fine too. But we have to do better. And it's not enough to just say Bernie's going to save us all. And that type of stuff just started to irritate me after a while, because when you having lived in, living now and working in the South, and then to see kind of the attitude, like, well, we weren't trying to compete in Florida, we weren't trying to do this. And just knowing the people, getting to know the people on the ground who were working really hard, and learning the stories and hearing the anecdotes, right? Anecdotes are not proven fact, but they actually are useful in understanding what the potential is. And we have to invest in the potential to expand progressive politics, particularly here in the South, because it is possible. I mean, it does resonate.
Well, I mean, no tea, no shade, but next time you guys come up with a phrase like Black Burner, as long as you get Doritos to sponsor you guys, I think that someone will come on board and be all about it. But I did want to say also, just thinking about some of the things you mentioned, right? Connecting more with the grassroots, making a greater effort to connect the dots between rhetoric and what's going on the ground. Are there any other things that you would want to see Bernie do, potentially considering that he's going to run in 2020? I mean, it definitely looks like he will.
It definitely looks like it.
So, like, what do you think if he runs in 2020, what do you think he should do more specifically to connect perhaps with Black Southern voters or voters, period, in the South? And then secondly, I would ask, for you, would you be willing to support him in 2020 as vocally as you did in 2016? And if so, what would it take for you to put your name on that list as a supporter again?
So I learned a lot, right? Because like I said, again, I've always voted, which is interesting. We can get into this later. I'm different from my parents in that respect, because, the generation, while I'm not as different from my parents as the King boys are from MLK, I am a little bit different from my parents, because, you grow up with people, you grow up in struggle, you grow up in spaces, and then you start to see the world on your own. And then you got to kind of fumble through it and figure it out for yourself, right? And my mom actually kind of smiles, not just to herself, but she's really loud and public about it now, because they see me coming more back towards them now as I'm getting older. But maybe that's a part of just like kids and rebelling against our parents, right? Right. If you have super radical leftist, really political parents, and then you kind of go the opposite direction to kind of be different, maybe I don't know. But thinking about what needs to be done better. I mean, I see that he's having an economic inequality town hall to follow up on the Medicare for All one. I see that he has a Black economist speaking, which I think will be excellent. I think that Bernie Sanders needs to surround himself with people who actually understand how to do this, right? And it's tricky because there aren't really that many people probably in politics who understand what it is to run an insurgency. I mean, even when you look at the folks that came out of OFA, those were still kind of institutional political types. But that model is still, crucial to when we're thinking about, success on grassroots success on a national level. But I think in terms of the issues, I mean, he has to be able to come off the farm a bit, right? Like, he can't be so wedded to those few topic things. You got to get comfortable. Like when I don't know if you remember this, but when he went to Baltimore, right, and he spoke, and he was walking through Freddie Gray's neighborhood, and they were talking to him about food deserts, and like he seemed really, and I'm not, I really believe he was genuinely concerned, and he was, really open and expressing like, wow, I can't imagine not having a supermarket. There was no follow-up. There was like nothing until after it was time for them to show up in Maryland 4 weeks before the election. Like that type of stuff can't happen anymore, right? You can't just show up. Like, I hope Democrats in general, and even third party candidates, I hope folks understand you literally can't just show up and expect people to vote for you because you write on the issues. Like, that's just not how humans are wired. Some of us might be wired that way, but the masses are not. And we need the masses to turn out to be able to overcome these institutional candidates. And so would I support him in 2020? I might vote for him in 2020. We'll see. Am I going to put it on the line and go hard and be working for free like I did in 2016? No. I am not necessarily, vote everybody Black just because they Black. But at the same time, I am really interested in seeing more of us exercise and leverage our ability to secure compensation for the work and labor that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if I'm going to be working for free doing anything, my voice is best spent, as it has been, more recently in the past year or so, on the outside, educating, elevating, and pushing on the issues, similar to what you do through your own work as well. Like, I'm not opposed to, publicly supporting him during a primary process if he is to run. But I would really hope that there are a lot of lessons. And it seems like there are some lessons learned. I mean, he did get it right this time and endorsed the pro-choice candidate, not the anti-choice one.
You're talking about Lipinski, right? This very recent one with Nancy Pelosi.
But it's interesting watching the evolution of a politician, particularly one that is of the age he is and has been doing this for so long. But he's still good on so many issues, right? So it's definitely a possibility. But I just really hope that in terms of staffing, in terms of the campaign, that some of the critiques and criticisms that have been raised, that he's really listening. I would like to see between now and 2020, though, a real concerted effort, and I think our revolution is trending this way, a real concerted effort to help build up that grassroots base of support, because people are running shadow campaigns basically to help get progressives elected. Mm-hmm. And we really need to see more of an investment in political education. Because, I mean, I'm all for the everyday average person to get involved, but we need to also be more educated about whether it's campaign finance, organization formation. Because one thing you and I see online is there are a lot of people who have formed opinions and stuff that unfortunately are malinformed or misinformed or uninformed, whatever the case may be. And they build such a strong opposition to something. It's like, do you even understand what you're opposing and why? Mm-hmm. Like the biggest thing for me has been the issue over like 501c4s, right? Like, yes, 501c4s are a tax identification, are organizational formation that can be abused. The fact that something can be abused doesn't automatically make it bad. It does mean that we need to hold people accountable and demand that there are, guidelines and stuff put in place. If we're going to say progressives are going to leverage and use the tools that are available to us, then we need to hold people accountable to that. That's absolutely true. But just the simple fact that it exists or that you're affiliated with one does not automatically make you, the new evil. So it's interesting in thinking about that stuff going forward. But I can't say right now, I'm not necessarily a fan of Bernie 2020 personally. I really do think that this time should have been built, instead of expanding his, level, to really develop a cadre of leaders to come after him. I'm not an ageist, but let's just keep it all the way funky. Bernie's approaching 80 years old. This is the biggest folly, I think, coming out of the civil rights movement and the Black Power generation, was that we didn't have a cadre of leadership. Probably also because that's a little different, because they struck down our leaders so young.
Right.
But we didn't have folks ready to step into those shoes on that same level, right? Because we were so busy building around specific individuals. And I think we really need to learn the lessons of the past 50 some odd years and trend away from that. Mm-hmm. And really start developing, full benches, so to speak.
So speaking of, developing and kind of building out politically, you yourself have been involved in doing some political coverage, I've noticed, in Georgia in particular. And I know you said you don't want to work for free anymore for something you don't feel like is worth it, but I assume that you're working for free on this particular project, and I would also assume that it is very much worth it. So can you talk a bit about your work that you've been doing in terms of covering politics in Georgia, talk about that project, and also what you're seeing happening on the ground in Georgia politically? Because I remember for a while people were talking about Georgia as a potential purple state, but over the past elections we saw that it went for Hillary Clinton in the primary, who's the more conservative of the two Democrats, and then went for Trump, if I'm not mistaken, correct? For the election, the general election.
Right.
What's going on in Georgia?
Well, Georgia has been trending blue, so to speak, right? Georgia has been within like 5 percentage points since 2008. So 2008, 2012, 2016, Georgia was within 5 percentage points. And I think actually 2008 and 2016 were the same exact. It was 5.2% difference between the Democrat and Republican votes. But so it was a lot closer compared to other, I think, red-leaning states, right? And there's so much hope in how to close that gap. And can Georgia actually turn, purple, or will it turn blue, whatever? And I mean, I certainly think that there is something to that if Democrats are willing to embrace a strategy similar to what we saw kind of be forced to happen in Alabama. And I say that it was forced because, Doug Jones's win was in spite of him and his campaign, not necessarily because of him and his campaign, right?
Definitely.
And I mean, and we see this happening all over the place. We see, there's a lot of hype put on, black women and the black vote and things like that. But I really do think there's something to be said about to steal the term, the new majority, right? Like you have your liberal and your progressive white voters. You do have your black, and we do have a growing Latino population here in Georgia as well. When you look at the voter demographics here, I think it's like between 30 and 40% of registered voters. It's like 30 and 40% of registered voters are black here in the state, right? And then which is a high percentage compared to other states. And then also, you have, when you're talking about Democratic voters, Democratic voters here in the state are predominantly black, and they're predominantly black women. So there is a base that exists. Whether or not we're willing to invest in that base and grow it and nurture it and really turn out that vote, that's the conversation we're having nationwide too, though, when we're talking about kind of Democrats as we look at the two major parties, right? But the same criticism I have for Democrats, I have for third party folks too. Because if you're trying to do something, you're trying to grow, and you're trying to overturn a trend in how people have been voting or how people have been supporting, you have to invest, whether you have the money or you have just the actual resources in terms of people power to engage people and build support and help people kind of trend your way. I like what the Baltimore Greens and Maryland Greens, I think overall, have been doing and really trying to build up that support and really build connection with community. I think folks in Colorado have also been trying to do something similar. Here in Georgia with the Democrats, there's still that divide. You still have the old guard that thinks we have to try really hard to win back the lost white voters that kind of trended away from, Democrats, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then you have those who are like, hey, we have this block that we have. We need to nurture it. We need to turn it out. We need to develop it. And if we stick to the issues, right, if we actually stick to the issues, we actually stand for something, some of those other voters might come back to us because they're tired of being shafted on healthcare, on education, on infrastructure, on jobs, right? Because we're here in Georgia, we don't have Medicaid expansion. There have been rural hospital closures. I think you saw my tweets about the 14 hours I spent in the hospital with my sister, who we live in a city, but she also doesn't have health insurance. So it's a similar, issue, whether you're living in rural Georgia or you're living in an urban area in Georgia, in terms of healthcare access, whether you might have community health centers or hospitals in your community, but if you can't afford to go there, you know what I'm saying, you're not getting the care. If you don't have them in your community and you have to travel a couple of hours to get someplace, that's a problem too. So there are similar issues, I think, that can unite people that we really need to be standing strong on and not trying to kind of trend to the middle or lean right to see if we can win that vote back, right? So here in Georgia, because I've been telling everybody for 2 years now, get local, get local, get local. Everybody got to get local. And my daughter called me out, told me I was a hypocrite. My 16-year-old was like, you always be telling people that they need to be getting involved locally, but you spend all your time doing stuff nationally. And one of the first things I was able to do that was really, and that's the first thing, but one of the things I was able to do that really was important to me locally was, even though I was supposed to be in DC at an event, but instead I stayed here and I got to speak in front of the National Lawyers Guild. They do a orientation for law students called Disorientation, right? And they bring in, progressive lawyers and stuff to kind of talk to the students. I don't practice in the same way traditionally lawyers do. I'm a licensed lawyer, but my actual lawyer work is not exciting. It's not the exciting traditional lawyer work you think of. But I was really excited to come in and speak, though, because of my activism and my involvement in independent media. And I got to talk about free speech absolutism and how free speech absolutism, it is a argument for privileged, predominantly white folks, usually those with money, to make. And that marginalized communities, we can't rely on that, because this whole notion that if we protect the free speech of some racist, right wing, extremists, that somehow that's protecting our speech too. They get access to platforms, they get access to spaces that we don't even get. So we're not even in the same space. And if somebody is on a medium complaining about how their free speech is being threatened, their free speech is not being really threatened, right? They're not targeted because they. So it's been really interesting in thinking locally here. I recently joined our DSA chapter not too long ago. A friend that I made here, Aaron Parks, is on the board of our Metro Atlanta DSA MATSA. And, I had already known a lot of really cool folks. And I'm like, yeah, join DSA. And I had been saying I was going to do it. I've been saying I was going to do it. I was saying I was going to go to a meeting. And finally, Erin twisted my arm because she actually came up to New York for the Afro Soch training weekend that they had. And she really wanted to start implementing activities and stuff here. So she hit me up. And finally, I was like, it's kind of a hypocrite, using my daughter's word, to start planning and doing activities with Erin under their banner and under the Afro Soch, banner, and not actually be involved and be in the space as well. So I went ahead and joined DSA, and that was my first meeting. Everyone was like, tell us about your first meeting. The first meeting was good, but we have this race that's happening, right, for governor. When I first moved here was in 2014, and I just voted for whoever the person was. My dad and I went and voted at a historic Black church, which was very interesting. And we, thinking about what's happening now. So yes, we have the battle of the Stacys. Oh, it sounds so dramatic.
Wait. Back up. There are two people running. So just to clarify, on the Democratic side, there are two women running for governor who cleared part of the primaries, right? And they're both named Stacey, or are they still? Is there still a primary to happen?
Our primary is still going on.
Okay.
Primary is in May. This week was qualifying week. They both qualified. They both, pay their fee. They both qualified to be on the ballot. And that's a whole other conversation about you got to pay to qualify to run for office, right? And some people,
do you know how much that fee is?
I don't know what the fee off the top of my head is for governor. I know for there's someone they're trying to hurry up and raise money for someone to run for agricultural commissioner, and I know that fee is like $3,400, and that's a statewide race as well.
Wow.
So I'm not sure exactly what the fee is for governor, but both women, qualified this week. So yes, they're both named Stacey. They're both.
It's like White Stacey and Black Stacey is how I've been referring to them, but I know they have last names. So one is Stacey Abrams,
one
right?
One is Stacey Abrams, and the other is Stacey Evans. They're both lawyers. They both grew up in poor rural families. They both have very compelling stories. So it's been really interesting. So I actually kind of stayed away from discussing the race for quite some time because, as you may know, or you probably remember, back in August during Netroots, I was a part of the group. I helped lead the group, actually, that interrupted Stacey Evans when she spoke. And that was a lot of backlash. That was a really interesting thing. So I kind of because of the way the media, I learned a lot from that incident. So if you're ever doing a direct action, make sure you have your presser, make sure you have your statement, your group statement ready to go, because at least you can point to that. Because everybody, they'll misconstrue, they would twist your actions and your words around, and it'll be a mess. And so for a long time, I didn't really want to comment necessarily on the candidates, because I just kind of got stung a little bit because of how badly, whether it was the Washington Post piece, and there was two or three local pieces, they completely just butchered and mismatched why it happened. And they latched onto the fact that at the end we started chanting "Trust Black Women." And now you see everyone uses that hashtag, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we started, chanting "Trust Black Women," not because we were saying that you need to trust and support Stacey Abrams, who had spoken earlier in the Netroots weekend, but that you need to trust us, those of us who were there. That morning, there was also an education conversation being led by Black women. Black women have been at the forefront of so many different movements. And if we're saying to you, hold up, you guys need to be thinking about who you let on the stage and brand as a progressive. And part of the issue, too, was she was speaking ahead of the NEA vice president. And
what's the NEA?
The National Education Association.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the issue was there is a bill here that that Evans supported that all the teachers groups fought against, right? She crossed lines away from the Democratic caucus and voted with the Republicans for this particular bill, a bill that actually didn't even ultimately, was opportunity school districts, and to basically take school districts under state control. And it actually didn't even affect the district she represented either, right? So she went against the actual Dem caucus, and that is to cause attention. So when Evans started running, her biggest thing has been the Hope Scholarship Program. Some states have programs where if kids do, whatever the bench hold is, and they'll give them some form of assistance, right? And that program was being gutted or possibly on a chopping block, I think back in like 2011 or so. And Stacey Abrams, who was the House Minority Leader, Black Stacey, she did some negotiating and stuff. And it left a sour taste in some people's mouth about how she did it. And this is a source of real contention for a lot of folks over whether to support her over this Hope Project. But she worked with the Republican governor, and negotiated a deal to from her standpoint to save it, right? Mm-hmm. And my position has always been, it's fine, criticize her on Hope if that's what you're going to criticize her on, but let's make education, let's put it all out on the table. And that's what we were trying to illustrate at that time. And we thought it was just insult to have, Evans speak on the same stage as the NEA vice president, which is a group that, did not support that action. But also, it was also like a weird signaling to have her speak the same time, ahead of Elizabeth Warren. Stacey Abrams, on the other hand, spoke on the same night with all the black people, right? Mm-hmm. Spoke on the same night with Barbara Lee, who was on, if you guys look at my Twitter profile, Twitter picture, Barbara Lee sat on the panel. We had Barbara Lee on the panel with us during that Roots. We talked about black people in progressive spaces and progressive while black. But it was just really, it was so much that went into it, right? And we talked about some of her other education folks. So if we're going to make education like the issue, because they were only trying to spoke on this one little sub issue, we need to make it the issue and talk about it. So, and until recently, no one else had really ever challenged her on her education vote record and stuff like that. And really no one challenges her across this whole race. So some folks are like, well, why don't you challenge Abrams? I did recently in the piece that I just wrote about the BDS vote back in 2000. March, I think it was March of 2016. There was an anti-BDS bill that came through the Georgia legislature. Stacey Abrams, Black Stacey voted against it. White Stacey voted for it.
So wait, let me back up. It was an anti-BDS bill. So what were the? Can you go into a little bit of detail about what the bill was proposing to do and why Abrams was against it, but it seems like Evans voted for it?
She did vote for it. So, and that's why I like, and with the piece I characterize, because it's being made out like somehow Abrams is the anomaly and is Jewish, anti-Israel for her vote, when really a major portion of, Democrats who were in the House voting at the time voted against it, as well as most of the sitting, I think everyone except for one person who was a part of the Democratic leadership voted against it, right? Mm-hmm. So the bill, I mean, it's similar to the other ones that have been peddled around the country that would penalize, folks who were engaging in, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, in various forms. And part of her rationale, even though what was bothersome for me personally is because she's getting challenged on it now, and we've seen how the issue of being, I don't know, soft on Israel, the topic is the best way I can think of it, how it can be used against black candidates, right? Mm-hmm. So we saw what happened to Donna Edwards. We saw what happened with Dwight Bullard down in Florida as well.
And just to clarify for people listening, Dwight Bullard and Donna Edwards were both running for office, and they had supported BDS in some, not even so... They were just a little bit right?
Better on Palestinian issues. They had like issues about Palestinian human rights statements. Mm-hmm. I think Dwight Bullard had actually went with it was actually a Dream Defenders group. I know it was a group of young activists that he went with, and they were in Gaza. I think it was while they were there, and that resulted in massive backlash when he was running for office, and they tanked him. In his effort, and then his seat was ultimately lost to a Republican. Like in the Florida legislature, they lost the seat to a Republican over this. Mm-hmm. This is how, and then, Donna Edwards lost. Haim Saban dropped $100,000 or more, I think, in the race against
$10,000 for.
Was it $10,000?
Yeah, but it was a local race, so $10,000 in a local race might as well be $100,000.
Yeah, I knew he dropped some with some zeros in it.
Yeah,
she was running against Van Hollen,
right.
He's against her because. Israel is his issue. So, but Abrams said at the time, and she has reiterated that her commitment to freedom of speech. I mean, this is actually when I finally got to meet her, this is actually what she said to me too about our protest. Even though she didn't necessarily agree with our protest, she understands, young people and activism and freedom of speech. And I respect that and appreciate that. So even though I don't agree with her on her statement and her affinity for Israel at the extent that it is, I do appreciate the fact that she recognized that having this type of curtail, not just on freedom of speech. When we're thinking about these anti-BDS bills, they're really a restriction on, right to protest, right to assembly, and there's another effort I see getting pushed through the Senate now, the U.S. Senate now. But so that's what she talked about. She talked about how this could be used against, other forms of protest, and we can't just, limit it this way. And we can't restrict people's speech in this way. And we can't restrict people's right to protest. And that's basically what she has stuck to. And I think that when you're, the candidates, there is no perfect candidate. We are going to find candidates we don't agree with. We're going to find candidates who don't go as far as we want them to on issues. But I do think that, what I've seen of her and her campaign, and her ability to think about the broader context of issues beyond what she personally feels, because she wrote this long Medium post talking about her affinity for Israel and all this stuff, and basically trying to calm people down here, who were getting annoyed. The Atlanta Jewish Times has had, I think 3 different pieces. There actually was one letter or 2 letters that were published for people who were supporters, saying that the articles attacking her over the vote were divisive and recognizing why she voted the way she did. But they were 3 op-ed pieces attacking her as not being, strong enough on Israel or not a real. And it's just this is a state level race. Why does that matter?
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting that we talk a lot about interference from Russia. And now we're starting to expand the discussion to talk about Saudi and potential Qatari interference. But it's kind of the elephant in the room that we never talk so much, at least in the mainstream media, about really blatant interference by people who work with AIPAC, or people who have focused entirely on Israel. And I know in the case of Haim Saban, he's literally said he's not even a partisan. It's basically his partisanship is based on who supports Israel in his mind and who doesn't.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that obviously needs to be more closely examined and discussed, and not in a way, obviously, that's anti-Semitic. I mean, I don't think it even goes there. I think just looking at Israel as a country and looking at the way those who advocate on Israel's behalf within the United States do have a pretty they go really deep. If you're doing local elections, city council even, I've seen, then that's a problem.
Right. So, and when we're looking at even the comments right now, right? We're looking at the whole battle right now over the Farrakhan stuff, but you have Chuck Schumer, who is, the ranking them in the Senate, and making comments talking about the Torah and how those people don't believe in what the Torah says. And, I mean, he just really ran up on anti-Arab, Islamophobic type statements to be able to. It's just how can we trust you as a quote unquote ally? When you're making statements and commentary in this type of venue in that way, and it's just I understand the concern over anti-Semitism. Why? Because I'm a black person living in America. Trust and believe. I understand what it is to be in a marginalized group. I understand that there are people out there who hate you just for existing because of, certain characteristics that are different, and who want to really undermine and destroy your very existence. I get that. But at the same time, the fact that, basically we're being told that we can't critique a system of government, right? Because that's what it is. And I agree with you. If the critique and if people's commentary is venturing into the area of being anti-Semitic and stuff, that definitely needs to be addressed and resolved, head up, because we can't tolerate that. Just like we can't tolerate anti-blackness, discriminatory statements in any other setting, we can't tolerate that either. But at the same time, a lot of things are being labeled anti-Semitic. Like one thing that I disagreed with Abrams about, in my piece was, labeling the entire BDS movement anti-Semitic.
Right, and it's not at all, but yeah.
BDS, I point to Jewish Voices for Peace, and the American Friends Movement, American Friends Service Committee, which my stepdad worked for. Those are 2, groups that are a part of the BDS movement, and their approaches, their strategy, just everything about them is so far from being anti-Semitic. The BDS movement is people are whispering about how it should get the Nobel Peace Prize. So there's so much more to it than just appeasing the sensibility of particular interests. And we got to be aware of that. And I can support a candidate. We all can support a candidate and still address the issues we have with the way they're making moves or politics, and still be true to ourselves. Because that's something that's, since I got asked recently in an interview if I'm a Democrat, and I'm I vote Democrat, right? I think a lot of us may, at times, if we do vote Democrat. I have voted third party maybe like twice. I'm going to keep it real. I voted for Jill Stein, not because I like Jill Stein. I got issues with Jill Stein. But I voted for Jill Stein because, I had some folks who were Georgia Greens who were like, oh, just vote. We need people to vote for us so we get that 5%. I was like, all right, I'm going to vote for you. And, like, if y'all don't get it, I don't want to hear it no more. Like, I did my part. And so, but, like, I have voted Democrat, but that's not a part of my identity. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not so like wedded to the party and the party line. I really think that we need to think outside the box on parties. So I consider myself more of an independent voter in that respect. But at the same time, like, I really think that when we're thinking about our politics, the choices, and I think you and I might have had this discussion about Angela Davis during the election, right? Angela Davis is probably, of our elders who are still existing and able to tell their stories and stuff, is one of the most is on that radical spectrum, right? She's
very far, actually.
Conscious, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But when she started talking that political pragmatism, that really broke people's brains. Right? And but I understand, kind of where she's coming from, because we still exist. No matter how much we're about to dismantle the system and deconstruct spaces, we still exist within these systems. And I refuse to cede ground to folks in matters that directly affects my life, the life of my children, the life of my family. So it's a weird balance. It's a really weird balance. And I don't know if my strategy is the right one, but it's the one that I'm comfortable taking for now.
Yeah. I was going to ask you as well, because you mentioned, some people that you don't agree with 100%, but that you vote for because you're thinking in more pragmatic terms, or even like in the case of Jill Stein, you're thinking in terms of ways to help forward third-party politics and progressive politics in a direction that perhaps at least interrupts the control that the Democrats have over quote-unquote left politics on the national spectrum. So speaking of problematic people, or perhaps people that rub other people the wrong way, but that we agree with a little bit on things, Imani Gandy. Can you please talk about this Imani Gandy interview? So for those who don't know, Anoa actually recently interviewed Imani Gandy for her podcast, which you should all listen to. It's a really interesting interview. And Imani Gandy, I have to explain so much, because I have to remember that not everyone's on Twitter as much as we are and may not know any of these people that we're talking about. So Imani Gandy is a reproductive rights activist. She was formerly an attorney, and now she does more advocacy work and writing on reproductive rights. And she's a Black woman. She literally goes by the handle Angry Black Lady on Twitter. So you recently interviewed her. Now, she's quite polemic in terms of her position with progressives online. She's known for being rather frank online, and I think pissing some people off. But at the same time, there has been a lot of anger geared towards her. Some of the things about her work past and her what seems like support of Hillary Clinton, but what she worded was less about supporting Hillary Clinton and more about being like rejecting Bernie Sanders. So I'm really curious about, first of all, what compelled you to interview her, especially considering all the drama that the dust that had been stirred up around her presence online. And then secondly, can you talk a bit about the aftermath? Because I too was caught up in the aftermath of it, because I agreed with her on some point.
I was so surprised that people came for you that way, though.
So I'm curious, like, how you dealt with it, why you chose to interview her, how you dealt with the backlash, and then kind of where you see this space, or what you learned from that process in terms of what it means to be a Black woman in alternative and new left media, and perhaps the limitations for us versus, I think, some of our male peers in this field.
So what compelled me? I've actually wanted to have a conversation with her, because I believe she was a real person, right? Like, I mean, because I'm someone, I've been pissed by her tweets and stuff too.
Right.
But I've read her articles, like, because with Rewire, like, I follow Rewire. She's a senior writer with Rewire. And her co-host for her podcast, Jessica and I have been on interviews on Eugene Puryear's show By Any Means Necessary before. So I have a general working relationship with her co-host. So I'm like, I've gotten to know Jessica. I respect her a lot. So I'm like, if Jessica messes with Imani like that, there has to be something else more to her. And not that I believe another white well, somebody needs the white stamp of validation or anything to make them okay. But at the same time, like getting to know the type of person Jessica is and what she stands for and what she values, and then reading some of the pieces, like, because I would find myself reading a piece from Rewire, like, oh my God, this is so good. And then I would read who wrote it, and I'd be like, oh my God, I can't share this. But then it's just like, you can't, there's some people like that's because I don't like her tweets doesn't mean I wouldn't share her articles. So I would share her articles, right? And some folks might not realize y'all was retweeting Rewire articles for me, right, not even realizing who wrote it.
Right.
There are some people who I wouldn't retweet their stuff. I wouldn't share it if that was the last source of information on earth, but and I'm, y'all can probably figure out who those people are, but I had actually wanted to talk to her for quite some time because I just wanted to know just more about like her. Like I had questions, and it wasn't about trying to rehabilitate her or make her like, I just want to have a conversation. Because if you listen to my show, and this is why I don't consider myself a journalist, because I don't do interviews with people that I very rarely have talked. I'm trying to think. I don't know that I could actually even think of a person that I talked to that I didn't want to talk to. I don't talk to people I don't want to talk to. I don't really do the gotcha thing, and I'm not I'll debate. I have no problem debating, but I just don't do it on my show, right? Like my space is a space for a conversation. And that's my tagline. Good people, doing good conversation with good people doing good work. Now, whether you like and appreciate her work, that's a completely different story. And, a couple of folks who I respect very much, who have had interactions with other people of color, women of color, I respected that we had conversations personally about it and how they felt about it and how they felt about me not directly challenging her to a few things. And you know what? I really appreciated that, and I understand where people are coming from. And at the time, though, that wasn't my focus and my purpose. I felt like if I at least get a rapport with her, that maybe she and I can have another conversation down the line about these things. But when I agreed, what happened was she responded to me defending her in a tweet. And I defended her in a tweet, not because oh my God, this is my fave. She has a huge following. I need to glow up on Twitter. But because something that was said, I felt was so problematic. I can defend another Black woman who is being, her work is being debased and devalued without necessarily being her friend or supporter or whatever. Because I really think if folks can get all in their panties bunched up about identity politics if they want to, but let's just be real here. Black women, you know what I'm saying? We do not get the same respect. We do not get the same space and platform as our white counterparts do in these progressive spaces. We don't. Liberal, Democrat, doesn't matter. We don't get it the same way. And so to see a discussion happen, now whether or not people agree or followed or paid attention to her back and forth, and she can be petty. And I'm all
that's an understatement, but yes.
She can be petty. She will go ham. She goes from 0 to 50,000. But that's her perspective, that's her space, and that's what she does.
And she told people right off the bat, right? Her tagline her username is literally Angry Black Lady.
Angry Black Lady.
So she's letting you know right away.
Right. And my thing is and it's a lot of people though who are like this on Twitter. I don't go into other people's spaces and tell them how they need to use the space they've cultivated. I may not agree with them because a lot of times I'll subtweet her, right? A lot, and I told her this when we talked too. There were things I said, yo, there are things you've tweeted that made me upset because I think the most recent thing was when she retweeted that New York Times article that had the tagline about Trump supporters in steel country or whatever, and the whole article, with the exception of one person, was all Black folks who worked at this one steel mill in a district who had all voted for Hillary, and Hillary had won the district. It was a misleading title, and she didn't read the article, and she admitted it too, that she didn't read the article, in a subsequent tweet or whatever. So instead of running up in her DMs, in her mentions about it, because I don't do that. There's some people I'll do that too, but for the most part, I don't really run up in people's mentions all the time. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I can be a mention thug too, but usually that's not my thing. And so I remember I've had people tweet her, or Feminista Jones is another one folks used to do this too during the campaign. I don't like that. I don't like when people will tweet other people into my timeline or into my mentions. I think that's unnecessary conflict. Not that I have an issue with conflict, but why are you doing that? Like,
Right.
I'm having and you do this a lot with your when you do your Twitter commentary. Like, it's like I'm informing on a point, okay? Right? Like, I don't need you to bring that person or their followers into my mention on this issue. And it's really interesting in the way people like you and I use Twitter versus other folks sometimes too, right? So what happened though was, like, what I saw was, and a lot of that stuff, there's been a lot of back and forth with her for a long time, and most of it I ignore, I disregard. Part of it because too, I'm not really interested in piling up with everybody else on another black woman. Whether I agree with her or not, I'm just not interested in that. I'm not really interested in a lot of the piling on that happens on Twitter, period. And actually, I have a lot of, I started muting words, phrases, and even people's Twitter handles. Like, yes, you can mute a person, but you can actually mute the handle as if it's a word, and it never even comes up in your thing at all. Like, I've had to do that for my own peace of mind. And so with her though, what I noticed though was there was a tweet or a conversation that was happening that came up in my timeline or something, and it was like, she doesn't do any real work, so and so does more than her, blah blah blah. I'm so sorry. You may not like the woman and how she tweets, but let's just all be real. Twitter is not real life. We may disseminate information, but what people actually do with their work, what their actual value is in life, is not measured by how they're tweeting. Let's just be real. And that's the issue I had personally, right? And so I made a comment or two, or maybe three, I don't even remember, and she saw them. So apparently I've been on her radar too, but she just ignores me as well. But so she said, thank you. She goes, I know we don't always agree or something like that, but thank you or something. So we had a brief exchange. She was responding to me. So since she was responding to me, I figured I'd ask her. I was like, yo, so would you be willing to have a conversation or come on my podcast, something like that? And she said, yeah, sure. So I already know their communications director. And so I got connected with her that way. We worked out the conversation. So we get on. We have a pre-conversation, right? Just kind of, to set the parameters and just to talk a little bit. Because I've never talked to this woman before. I've never had any interaction before besides those few little tweet exchange. And so I liked her. That's just plain and simple. I had a really good conversation with her. And what people are not going to understand, because you're not me, so you're not going to understand this. I am a black attorney, right? I am a black attorney that has been trying to transition out of what I've been doing since I became an attorney. Like, I came out of school during the financial crash. I had this vision in mind of the work I would be doing and the mode I'd be going into, and that was taken away from me. And I've been in a process of rebuilding. So to sit and talk with someone to understand what her trajectory was, to see someone doing kind of what I've been struggling to figure out how to do, that was just a really interesting conversation to me. So it's possible that I could have challenged her more directly or been more critical in some points. And I'm just going to keep it real. I got so enthusiastic to finally talk to someone who understands how this transition could possibly work and what it is to go from being the attorney, kind of like, working to, pay your bills and pay your student loans and stuff, to doing something that you're really passionate about that might not have been your actual, like, what you studied. Like she understands the transition. So for me personally, I got caught up in having that conversation and just having a discussion with someone that it completely, to some extent, like I said, I got caught up in having that conversation, not having this broader conversation and being more critical and, oh my God, I should have challenged her on the one tweet. And I can't remember if she actually addressed, so because there were some things that we talked about pre-conversation, and I think, obviously when you talk to people who aren't on the, when sometimes they're a lot more frank and a lot more, candid than they are when you're recording. And in some ways, it's possibly like, because I don't script, I just have conversations with people. So not everything comes out exactly the way people think they should. So we just had a natural conversation, and that's what happened with that episode. And I thought it was a really good conversation. It wasn't the conversation people wanted, because people wanted me to be fighting, screaming, cursing, and yelling at her and telling her that she's the worst freaking human being on earth. Let's just be real. And whether or not you believe that or not, you can say that for your own commentary. I'm sure there's been plenty of it. I'm going to keep moving on, because a lot of people who were upset with me aren't patrons anyway. So, I mean, let's just be real. You might have retweeted something, but it's not like you were even giving me $1.
Right.
And so I was expecting to have like this mass exodus. And I mean, there have been a couple people who unsubscribed or who didn't, but let's just, the body of my work, I'm consistently the same person I have been since I started this. And having that conversation with her was really cool for me. Um, and I think it opens the door to have other conversations with her. But I mean, folks are like, well, she's trying to rehabilitate herself through you. I'm like, I don't really know that that's true either. I don't think that she sees that she needs to rehabilitate herself, because I don't think that she really thinks that who she has been wrong. She may concede, and she did concede a little bit, that maybe she, could have been better in certain areas. But I don't think that she would say that she's been wrong. She was who she was. She was genuinely. I don't know. I'm not going to make a assessment of her genuineness, but she was who she was.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And that was the space that was provided for us to have a conversation. I've had conversations with lots of people. People who were upset with me because I was talking about how happy I was to meet Donna Edwards during Netroots. I was very happy to meet Donna Edwards during Netroots, despite some of the crazy thing about meeting Donna Edwards during Netroots was I had actually just been challenging Donna Edwards on Twitter, and then all of a sudden she shows up in the event we're at, and everybody's like, oh my God, Donna Edwards. So when I introduced myself to her, she goes, I know your name, because I had just been in her Twitter mentions. She was very gracious, and we had a great conversation right there, and we hugged. Again, she's another Black woman attorney. There's so few of us. People really don't understand this, right? But she also went through law school as a single parent. So there is another level that I can connect with people that isn't based on our politics necessarily per se, right? There's this personal cellular level that we're connected on. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to call out people on bad takes and bad politics, but that just means that sometimes Anoa is human, and I need to connect with people and relate with them on a level that my audience may not like or understand. I have people telling me like, oh, I got to unfollow you. Cool, do you, boo? Because you're not paying bills over here.
Well,
So, I mean, that might not be a good, rundown for folks, but that's where I was at. Like, I had a conversation and I enjoyed it. Now, it could have been more critical, could have been more challenging. Absolutely, I'm open to constructive criticism about it. You gave me some, quite a few people gave me some, but it was a good conversation.
I mean, too, one of the things that I've noticed is that when it comes to Black women and Black people in particular on Twitter, there's some things that I noticed. So on the one hand, I noticed that there seems to be a really massive excitement when two or more Black people are fighting about politics or fighting about anything. And it reminds me a lot of you see these, I'm reminded always of that scene in Django where the slave master wants the slaves to fight. Like he literally has slave fights for entertainment, right? And I think there's a degree of sort of voyeuristic pleasure and almost a sort of, I think for some people, they want to live vicariously through the Black person who's always willing to criticize only other Black people and like try to tear them down. So they know that nowadays, we sort of have this like liberal bubble of like if you're a white person, you can't call out you can't call out Black people, which I disagree with. But I think that there's this there's this idea that, okay, you only call out people like yourself. And so I think for some white liberals and potentially white progressives, as I've noticed, there is what seems like a certain type of joy in watching some other Black people that they support, but usually only on the basis that they tear down other Black people. The other thing I think that's important here too is that there is definitely a double standard on who gets flack for people that they interview and people that they align themselves with, or even not necessarily align themselves with, but may agree with on one point or one aspect, something that they connect with, like in your case, both being Black women and Black lawyers and having these concerns over reproductive rights, right? People see that and will freak out about it if they disagree on one thing, but then they will, in the same day, go and retweet someone who's highly problematic, who maybe has suggested that we ally with actual white supremacists and, like the alt-right, and not think anything of it. And so it's very interesting to me that I think there's certain people, and most of them tend to be Black women, funny enough, who trigger certain people online and certain responses, and not just online, but offline too, right? I think that in a lot of ways, Black women are often not only marginalized, but at the same time hyper visible for people to criticize. And I'm wondering for you, how have you dealt with your position, again, as a Black woman in New Left media, in alternative media, independent media? What have been some of the challenges that you've faced beyond what I've mentioned here and even brought up with regard to the Imani Gandy interview? Has there been something else, other issues that you've dealt with that you could tell us a little bit about?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is just, is building an audience. And I'm sure you understand this, building an audience and building support and really getting the voice out there, right? Having participation in spaces. And there are some folks who are like, oh my God, you're so great, I love you, or whatever. And I'll get certain nods and certain respect, but it's really trying to break into those larger platforms that can be a challenge. There are these spaces, right, that are predominantly male and they're predominantly white, right? Because if there are Black folks or folks of color in spaces, they're usually men. Mm-hmm. And there are so few spaces for us. And I'm not trying to necessarily do this full time per se, because quite honestly, I have a ton of student loan debt and I have 2 kids, 1 year and go to college. So I don't know that anyone will actually pay me enough to transition from my current position to do this full time. But when we talk about uncompensated labor and a lot of the work in terms of we build with, building and curating information and content, right? That investment, I think, that we put into people, because not that I'm trying to get Chapo money, but like it would be nice to get a little bit more. But at the same time, like, I think this expectation that we're supposed to go the lengths and that we're supposed to, mother and nurture folks without expecting anything in return, the respect factor, like, you're only respected as a voice so long as you stay within, certain parameters, because if you stray, it's like the worst thing ever, like what happened with the Imani Gandy thing. And it's not, people disagreed, that's fine, but like people took it personally. People were just like, ridiculous. And how could you say that? Like, I'll go ahead, like, Walker is not perfect. Folks should be criticizing Walker too, because Walker is wrong. Like, folks who were attacking her because, oh my God, you were a foreclosure attorney. Like, part of it being an attorney and actually understanding what people do. Like, there are people in our spaces who are corporate attorneys, right, who also work in certain types of law that might be like abhorrent, but we're not attacking them because they're the good Black people on our side. So I really do think that we need to, like, step back. But as, the few of us who are in these spaces having these conversations and dialogues, we need to hold our so-called comrades and allies more accountable, because they will go so hard something about, like, my interview, right? But then they'll let other stuff slide, or it's not that, or they didn't really mean, or whatever the case. So the double standard that exists is something that's really hard. And for a while, like, it's gotten a lot better. But for a while, like, Ben and I would make the same point. Ben would get so much more elevation. I mean, he also has a bigger platform, but it's like Ben, and I had to get on him once too. I was like, you're literally saying what I said on your show last night. You better give me credit. Don't be like Roland Martin stealing from Black women on Twitter. But like I would find that happens too. Like, our voices just don't carry as much weight without someone else to validate or give us space. And that has been a challenge, as building up, space and access to help. Because really, I mean, again, it's great to get paid for what you do, but at the same time, it's really more about engaging and influencing people and helping folks expand their minds and understanding about not just, candidates and politics, but about issues that we need to delve kind of deep on and start thinking about getting about what's possible. Like, I really think that, the next several cycles, over the next generation, we have a lot of potential if we're laying the right groundwork and informing and engaging people the way they need to be at the local level. That's not going to happen, by relying on whomever can finally get a spot as an MSNBC commentator. You know what I'm saying? Like when we think about, like, movement journalism, we think about folks who are connected to these more radical progressive spaces. Like, that's the type of system we need to figure out how to build out so that we're connecting people and providing alternative voices. So that is one of my struggles. I think I find I think it's something we struggle with as women, period, in these spaces, right? And I think as a Black woman, it is a little bit more difficult because, men are just, I mean, like I said, these are very dominated male spaces, and men are just more naturally inclined to gravitate towards other men to do stuff. And I think when they do come to us, it's usually very specific marquee issues and not really the same robust dialogue our male counterparts may get.
And I would even... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, sorry. I was going to say, I will give Ben credit, though, because I was his first co-host. Like, he had a lot of people who would come on and do panels and contribute. He had contributors, but I remember he kept saying I was the first person that he actually let co-host. So Ben was slightly ahead of the curve.
Well, that's good. I mean, the only thing I would say here is that I think it's not so much about men being naturally inclined to speak to and only be able to hear other men, but I think they're definitely socialized in this way, right?
Good point. Good point.
I think that we're kind of, even women too, I think we're kind of taught to see men as authority figures and correct. So
I agree.
Sometimes we don't even hear each other, which is really, it's an interesting problem and something that today, as we're speaking on International Women's Day, funny enough,
right.
We need to kind of work toward changing. The last thing I actually wanted to ask you is about your family's political history as well, and how that touched on and changed some of your own political trajectory. I mean, you've mentioned them a bit in this interview, but I'd be curious to know, especially now that you're sort of flirting with socialism and you're thinking about moving a little bit further to the left, at least in terms of your organizing too. How did your family play a role in that? And what is your family's connection to leftism? I mean, this is a podcast about leftists of color after all.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to learn a little bit about their history as well.
Well, and it's so funny because I was scheduled back in December to have a conversation with Fred Hampton Jr. ahead of the anniversary, and we were just schedules and family life, whatever. And I dropped the ball, and we haven't been able to reschedule. But my stepfather, so my father, my father's a pretty progressive guy. Grew up in family's from East Coast, so my stepfather's from Jersey City. My mom and my dad are from New York. My mom's from upstate. My dad's from Brooklyn. My dad is an odd dude, right? My dad grew up in the projects, grew up in Gowanus projects, became a vegetarian at like 17 or something like that, became vegan in his early 20s. So my dad's been vegan like over 40 years. He was a black acupuncturist. He actually studied a little bit under Mutulu before Mutulu was arrested, Mutulu Shakur, that is. So like my parents have this very interesting, my stepfather is a former Black Panther, and he was a part of the founding group for critical resistance. And he is a part of the Jericho movement, and he worked for American Friends Service Committee, and he's done a lot of work around prison abolitionists and just prison political prisoners and prisoners of war. My stepfather testified before the UN and just all types. I mean, they're all, my mom has also been similarly involved in, Malcolm X grassroots movement, New African People's Organization. She and my stepfather consider themselves citizens of the Republic of New Africa. I think my stepfather may have actually held position in the provisional government before. They were friends with, all three of them were friends with the late Chokwe Lumumba. My dad actually has a story about the first time he came down south. It was in the 70s, and they were in Mississippi and with Chokwe. And he said like they were in a supermarket, so somebody called them boy, and they all bust out laughing, but then they all made sure to hurry up and leave town. My dad's a kid from Brooklyn. So my family, my godmother, who became my legal guardian in high school, she did civil rights and police brutality cases out of Chicago. John Burge, Chokwe was one of her mentors. The organization he was a part of, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, that she's a part of, I'm actually now on the board of. So it's a very interesting trajectory in the world, right? And being in that world and space. So growing up in a really socially conscious, politically conscious Black, household, electoral politics, that wasn't the type of stuff we talked about, whatever. A lot of it was like, there was protest actions and really being deeply involved in actual direct organizing and change work, is the type of stuff. I mean, like, I remember one of my earliest protests that I can remember participating in was the anti-Columbus Day protest, right? We would go visit, folks who were political prisoners. And I mean, there was this really interesting relationship to thinking about politics that were pro-Black and just making sure, just even as a kid, just making sure we understood the real history, right? Like I remember writing a paper. You know, you got to write about the conquistadors or Columbus or whatever, usually when you're in middle school. And my stepfather, we were living in Chicago at the time. We had moved to Chicago. He took me over to the Puerto Rican Culture Center, and we checked out some books, and I was able to write about Pizarro, but I was able to write, you know, a more accurate reflection of Pizarro. And my teacher was like, I've never even heard of these sources, but they were valid books, so they had no choice but to accept it. I had a similar issue my junior year of high school when I was actually I lived in West Virginia for a year when I was in high school, and we had to pick someone who we felt like I forget what it was, something about an American. And so I did Asada Shakur, and my teacher was like, I couldn't do her because I couldn't find any books on her in our school library. Wow. And I rolled my eyes. So I actually had to, before she would let me do my paper. Now, mind you, J. Edgar Hoover was on our list. Malcolm X was on our list. Martin Luther King was on our list. But J. Edgar Hoover was on our list. Wow. When I saw J. Edgar Hoover, I was like, well, I'm going to do Asada Shakur. So, and, you know, I had explained who she was to the class. I remember one of my classmates turned around to me and said, isn't you supporting the Black Panthers like me supporting the KKK? And it was just the oddest question. I'm like, no. And then I had explained to the class, and I ended up doing well in the paper, but I had to have more sources than everyone else. So we fought it, but still, I still sourced the heck out of my paper in high school.
Good for you.
But those, well, I was, like I said, I was living with my godmother's a law professor, and you know, the lawyers who represented Asada and Angela, and coming out of NCBL, this is their 50th anniversary this year. Those were her mentors when she was coming to law school, right? So she's already coming through that vein as well on the legal arm side of things. So growing up with all these people has been very interesting. But again, like when you're a kid in these spaces, and particularly growing up with my parents, like we weren't well off. You know, we were poor. We were poor. And so there's a part of me that grew up kind of resenting the movement stuff because we were poor. And like when you're living in someplace, like when you're living in a regular neighborhood and you're going to a regular school, so it wasn't like I went to an Afrocentric school like the one my mom teaches at now. You know, I already got hit with the African name. Then I had the quote unquote nappy hair growing up. Then you want to put me in a dashiki every once in a while and send me to school too. Like I was looking to get beat up. So as a kid, so our socialization at home was so vastly different than our socialization in the world. My brothers both started going by various nicknames because, you know, their African names are a little bit more complex than mine. And so, you know, we assimilated in our own ways and had our own struggles growing up. But finding myself, but I always had that, you know, I always had my basic analysis, understanding racism and injustice and things like that as I struggled with more of the how radical on the political spectrum would I actually end up being. And I'm still not as radical as my parents are. Not by the stretch of the imagination, but they see me trending more towards them and they get so excited. And my dad is like, that's okay, because still when we get to bring all the people on the land, you'll be there. And so it's really interesting being in spaces with my dad and going to events with him now that we're all here in Atlanta. Everyone lives in Atlanta now. And my dad and my stepdad both live here in Atlanta. I go to stuff with my stepdad. And I get to listen to people, and I get to be a part and share space with him. And hopefully I'll be able to have him back on. My stepfather, like I said, he did 17 years in prison, stemming from an incident with Virginia state troopers that ended up. He has a similar incident to like the Asada story, basically. His two comrades, one of them was my uncle. They were shot by Virginia state troopers. It was you know, nonsense in the 70s, and he actually ended up being in prison, I think, for 17 years. Wow. It resulted in my uncle's murder. So there's actually a book written by one of his comrades, Safia Bukhari, about, you know, their experience. But listening to him and talking to him, so he's now Muslim as well, so he does not do electoral politics, right, him personally. But it's interesting when we have conversations and he understands where I'm coming from, because I'm like, I understand that we're building towards and we're working to build these other systems. However, I just can't see ground. Like I can't not be involved in this in terms of what's going on with school board and, you know, mayoral stuff. So I still see that we have to do both and, right? So that makes me a little bit, you know, I guess less left than them in some ways, right? When it comes to the electoral side of stuff. But I think when we start talking about, you know, how to empower people, how to like build our own schools and our own communities and things like that, I think that I'm right there with them where that needs to be at. You know, gaining access to resources. Like my mother now she's been teaching, I think it's 5 years at a school here called Colombo. It's an independent African-centered school. It's so beautiful going in there. The kids, you know, kids are a pain no matter where they are or what age they are, but they do like rituals. It's built into the process. So kids yes, they're getting the regular curriculum, whatever, but they're also getting curriculum that is infused with their history, and they see themselves in everything that they're doing. And there's a community that's built around that school and the families, and it's a really, important thing, particularly when youth are growing and trying to see themselves. So I appreciate the fact that my kids, though, have been able in more recent years to be kind of around their grandparents and the activism. And as they're starting to learn more about that stuff, and they're like, wait a minute, Papa Masai did what? Mommy, Grandma did what? Did wait a minute. They know who? Like, oh, wow. So it is interesting in thinking about the family. As the oldest, I've kind of, been connected to it the most. My younger sister comes along to stuff with me, and she kind of plays assistant with me. Like, she's been out to People's Summit, some other stuff with me. So I have my foot in spaces my parents aren't necessarily in, right? But at the same time, so like with the Power to the Polls, I spoke at the Power to the Polls event down here, and my mom and my stepfather came. And I was surprised that my stepdad wanted to come. Like, he was upset. He was like, why didn't you tell me about this? And I was like, oh, because I didn't think it was your thing. But what he appreciated about it, and then, there's a lot of complaints about the Women's March folks and the Power to the Polls and like the way they do things. But I was really surprised that he was positive about it, because they had a progressive village where you could meet like organization folks. So he really liked that setup. And he was like, you got to kind of reach the people where they are. Mm. So he was like, hopefully, there'll be steps that go beyond this. But he also appreciated that somebody slightly radical like me got on the microphone, because he was like, I don't know that anyone else has a background like yours. And he liked the fact that I was able to get a white supremacy in there when I was talking. But it was cool seeing these spaces through their eyes and all that they've seen and done. And then also, like, I'll call them up and I'll ask them questions. Like, I'll ask my stepdad questions, like, how do you do this? How do you get this going? Like, how do we do this? And it's a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of time. And it takes resources that we don't necessarily have either. And so I appreciate that he and I are in different spaces politically, but we're actually way more connected and similar. And he's actually really surprised when he listens to, like, my podcast. And he'll start suggesting people for me to interview or connecting with folks. And I'm like, yeah. Or he'll be surprised who I'm already connected to. He's like, oh, you know about this already? I'm like, yeah, Daddy. Like, he actually just saw Black Panther. My mom had went with us. My mom, my dad, and my stepmom, we all went together. My stepdad just saw it, because he was like, he didn't want to see it, but he finally decided to see it, because he's not into movies like that. But he saw it because he was like, there's been so much commentary around it, and people want to have discussion groups and come meet for coffee and talk about it. And so he was like, you wouldn't believe what people are saying about this movie. I was like, I know, Daddy. Like, I'm very active on social media. I know what people are saying. I've seen it all. So it was interesting to have a conversation with him, with his experience and background about issues and stuff. Like, I would even talk to him when we were going through all that stuff in the summertime about the people joining with the alt-right and stuff. I would talk to him about that stuff in his own organizing, his own work. Like I said, they work with the American Friends Service Committee. He's done a lot of work around prison control units and stuff. So really trying to understand how to find a niche, how to communicate and reach people, and kind of what's the best use of energy. And so he gets on me about arguing with people on social media all the time. But at the same time, he gets that, kind of being in this vein in terms of like, information creation is a little different than people who do the actual organizing. So I appreciate when I have the opportunity to kind of shadow him and go to events and learn more, because it helps me kind of start figuring out who I want to be as an activist or organizer, like, as a person. And as I'm kind of leaning left, right? Because again, I've never been good about titles and stuff or labels, but joining, DSA, and obviously there's certain principles and ideas that have already been natural. But I haven't like called myself a socialist, or I don't really get into like that socialist versus capitalist analysis in my commentary, not because I don't think it's important. It's because I'm going to be honest with everyone, and Alexander the Man, who disappeared on us from Twitter, but like he actually challenged me last summer. A lot of stuff happened last summer. Last summer was radical and wild, but he was like, your commentary about race will be so on point, but you don't go that next step and start talking about capitalism. Mm-hmm. And honestly, part of my issue is that I don't think I'm as well versed, right, in a lot of the critique and analysis. Not that I don't understand. I understand the differences, but if I think that I'm going to speak authoritatively on something, I want to really understand the nuance. so much better than I do. So I understand it for my own purposes that I'm comfortable identifying a certain way, but I don't delve into certain conversations because I think like you, Devin, there's so many people who do it really well. Like I'd rather just share from you or like engage one of you all to talk about it, right? Because, I'm gonna be all real with everyone. Like I'm really busy. I don't have time to read up on enough stuff either. Like there are some people in our space, I won't name their names, who I can't stand, and they're real good about quoting academic stuff. That's because they're able to sit around and read all the time. I don't have that luxury. And so I'll rely on you or Devin or whomever else as more of the expert on certain stuff versus me trying to pretend I'm all super, expert on socialism and communism, things like that. I'm just like, I just have to ask somebody a question. And so that's just me in my own, personal space. But it is, I'm really appreciative of the space that is here locally with our DSA. And I look forward to seeing where it can go. I think the way that they have allowed, like I mentioned Erin Parks earlier, Erin, she's a little older than I am, Black woman, really fierce, all around, really bold, out there, socialist. I think watching how she's been allowed to have access, and not allowed, but she's come in and taken space and they've yielded to her. And I think seeing the opportunity for more of us to be in those spaces, and she's pushing them to go out into the greater community here. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do. And I'm looking forward to get more involved at the national level with DSA as well, because I think that nationally, there has been, I had already been looking towards joining a DSA. Like, I'm not really a joiner with organizations and stuff, but I did go ahead and do it because I've actually met quite a few really amazing people who organize with DSA across the country. Whether national figures may have their issues, there are some amazing people from various chapters who I've met, who I've engaged in conversation to kind of just ascertain more. And I'm like, okay, this does seem like a space that I can fit in. And I would like to see more of how to bridge maybe the space between where my stepfather organizes and does work, to see if there's collaboration opportunities and stuff like that. So it's really interesting, like, to be that next generation trying to carve out space. Like his generation, he's approaching 70. His generation, went through so much. Like, he's a former Vietnam. He was in the Marines in Vietnam, came back home, was in the Panthers, was in other movement spaces. His best friend was murdered. He ended up going to jail, and he came out and still has done really amazing work. And he's a great dad and grandpa and stuff. And he's just such a wealth of knowledge and resource for me, and it's such a blessing to be able to talk to him. And he's the humblest man on earth. Like, he hates when I introduce him. And that's a part of the Islam a little bit too. I think but at the same time, it's just really, like I said, my mom, on the other hand, she loves the limelight. Yeah, it's shining on her. But it's been really good with all of them, really getting to know and understand more. And apparently I'm teaching them things, right, through my interviews and my podcast, because they're seeing a space that they had completely rejected. Electoral politics in these spaces, these, white progressive-led orgs, are something that they didn't deal with, and for good reason, right? Like, their generation has good reason for being skeptical. We have good reason for being skeptical too, but I think the landscape that we're in now, is a different space. It requires multiple strategies. So that's the family bit, and who knows what my kids might do. My daughter is she's very much into LGBTQ advocacy and environmental issues. So I don't know where they'll take it to next. But Max is probably just going to go to the NFL. He probably won't do any activism. I think he said he'll write his sister checks for her work. But it's going to be interesting to see where the next generation after us takes this too, because I think that we're on the precipice of something if we can sustain it.
Hopefully we can. I just want to say one last thing, though. I definitely now feel like you owe me a picture of yourself as a little kid in a dashiki. I'll look forward to getting that email. I have
one for you. I think I have one with me with something with maybe with a dress with pants on. Because my dad had a thing about making me wear pants with dresses. So I think I actually have one that I can send.
Well, definitely send it to me, because now it's going to be how I will forever remember this interview and this discussion.
Head wraps and everything when I was up until I was probably about 11. Or I'll get one from my mom. Yeah.
You should just send me a zip drive full of a zip file of pictures of you in neo-African garb.
It was okay when we were in New York, because when we lived in New York, we lived in Harlem and the Bronx, right? So New York in the 80s was fine, because there was a lot of that, particularly in Harlem. There was a lot of that.
Right.
I mean, when we ran up and down 125th Street, my aunt made puppets, and she was a vendor. We would run up and down 125th Street. My mom still says it. She goes, "Honey, I could drop y'all off at one person stall, come back, y'all would have been fed and got a new book." And so, like, it was a very different culture in New York. Then when we moved to Chicago, the South Side, it's a whole other world. You were African booty scratcher, like all this stuff. It was a completely different world.
Yeah.
And it was complete opposite.
Well, it's a really interesting background, and like I said, I look forward to getting the zip file of photos. Thank you so much, Anoa, for speaking with me. This was great, and I learned a lot, and I appreciate you sharing so much about your own changes politically and that of your family. And I don't know, I wish you the best of luck in all that you do. So thank you so much again.
I appreciate you so much for providing space. I mean, I think your project, I think this is amazing what you've been doing, and I'm so excited for all the work you continue to do. And I'm glad we got to hang out in New York, and hopefully we'll get to hang out again in the future. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks. And thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Left Pocket Project podcast. You can find this and more episodes by going to Spreaker, SoundCloud, or iTunes and entering simply Left POC, and that's LEFTPOC. You can also keep up with the Left Pocket Project on Twitter, Facebook, and other places where you get your fine social media fix. By the way, just as an FYI, for those of you who haven't checked out the Twitter or Facebook page yet, each week I do a special feature called Left POC of the Week, where I focus on a specific leftist of color or movement that was led by and comprised of leftists of color. This week I focused on the life and work of a woman by the name of Marielle Franco, who was a leftist city councilwoman in Rio in Brazil, who was recently assassinated, specifically on March 14th. You can find more about her life and work, as well as the life and work of other leftists of color in the U.S. and abroad, by visiting the Facebook page or the Twitter page and checking out Left POC of the Week. The other thing, just in terms of quick news, is that don't forget that Richard and I have the special series called Reading Revolution. Next month's Reading Revolution will focus on media and propaganda. So if you have any questions, concerns, or things that you'd like for us to discuss as we talk about media and propaganda as it relates to the left and also against the left, please feel free to shoot us a line on the Curious Cat by going to Curious Cat and searching for, again, Left POC, and we will address your comments and questions on our next show. Finally, I'd like to give a huge shout out and thank you to all of the people supporting the Left Pocket Project on Patreon. From $1 donors to $5 comrades, your contributions go a long way. If you would like to add to these contributions, feel free to visit patreon.com, and that's patreon.com/leftpoc to show your support. Thanks so much and have a good one.